Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is where you are. My name is Peter Bevelou, based in London, so it's already quite late in the evening here. Yeah, thank you for attending. And so today I'd love for us to have a bit of a discussion about the embeddable web on Android. Yesterday, you might have attended a talk by a colleague of mine, Peter Kahn, about custom tabs, trusted web activities, and some of the other technologies we have to merge some of the boundaries between the web and native. But the talk still very much focused on having either the web or native. And in reality, what we're seeing is that there's also a number of applications that are a bit of both. So to extend on that a little bit, we often think of the web, particularly on Android, as something that's being experienced through a browser. Could be Chrome, could be the Samsung browser, Microsoft Edge, Firefox. It's something that's quite top of mind from at least my own users of the web, but also of many users and developers. If it works in the browser, it's probably going to work everywhere, right? What we're actually seeing is a situation that's a little bit different. The browser is obviously a major component in the way how our users experience the web, but there's more to it than that. Often you start a journey on the web to read some content, to participate in a conversation or anything like that, not in a browser because you're browsing around, but because a page that was shared with you on a social media application. Maybe you're starting to read an article based on a news aggregation application. And those are flows that start outside of the browser. And there's an incentive for developers to kind of keep you in their environment, make it easy to go back. Maybe you have a reading list. And there are basically free platforms that we have available to serve our users in that area. So first, browser. I think that's pretty clear. So let's skip that part. Next to the browser, we've got custom tabs. Custom tabs share state with the default browser. It has implementations by Samsung. Firefox has an implementation. Chrome obviously has one, and it refers to the default browser when this is available in the system and provides a custom tab implementation. It shares state with the browser, which is different from Webview, which has isolated state. Now, this is something that will be more important later in the conversation. What this means in practice is that if you've visited a page before in your browser, for example, a news website or Twitter or anything, when you open it in a custom tab, you're already signed in. Your state is there. Whereas if you open it in an application that opens a Webview as an in-app browser, for example, a social media app or a news reader, then your state pretty much starts from scratch. So you're signed out again. In extension, you can think of Chrome custom tabs as something that builds upon the browser itself, kind of as a specialized UI of the browser that combines the interest of you as a user and of a developer by making sure that they, for example, their own back button or an extra entry in the menu itself. Like state, this also means that web platform features are shared with the browser, settings are shared with the browser, and it has a very close mapping on how it behaves, how it interacts, and what the state between the two are. And this is where Webview starts to be quite different. Webview is its own content embedder. Recall the layers in the Chromium source code. And what this basically means is that the layers in Chromium code where the profile, the state, where user interface is implemented, which we call the Chrome directory, are not included in a Webview build. And this leads to quite some fragmentation in the web platform. Features like notifications, background sync, background fetch are available in the browser, in custom tabs. They're not available in a Webview. And this causes a number of fragmentation, particularly if users and developers don't know that this is a thing in the first place. Now, obviously that's a bad thing, but there are reasons why you might want to use a Webview. The way how I think of this is that I think custom tabs are great for the user, but there's a trade-off for the developer because they have less control. You can't add your own buttons, that back button doesn't exist, and usually having a user journey as our users start, having that be continuous throughout the native application and a custom tab works quite well. You can get back as opposed to the browser. Whereas Webview, by not sharing state, is actually much friendlier to the developer. You can do whatever you want. You've got your own state. You can access a DOM, inject JavaScript, but the cost of that is that you don't have state. So you're actually penalizing the user in a way. So The way how we think of this is that there are really two sorts of fragmentation on the platform that is created by this situation. The first we think of as state fragmentation. And ask yourself the question when, if you're a user on an Android device, you might have run into a situation that you think, I'm sure I was logged into this website. Why isn't autofill working? Why isn't my payment information here, even though I was on this website yesterday? Or even like cross-platform questions, such as quite often I remember visiting a website. I just don't know how I visited a website. Was it a custom tab? It's not in my Chrome history, and that actually makes it quite hard to keep track of where I use the web on Android. And from a developer point of view, this leads to reduced re-engagement. It loses site-specific state. For example, you might have a shopping cart in one environment, but not in the other environment. And that just depends on how you get there as a user. And that's actually really confusing. The second way how we think of this is API fragmentation. So this is something that's probably closer to us as Chromium and Blink developers. This is highlighted by the Mozilla Web MBA survey, both in 2019 and 2020. I actually couldn't find a PDF for 2020. And developers are finding that having to support specific browsers, that having to test in different browsers, that after the fact figuring out that something that they built for one browser doesn't work in another browser is actually a really big problem, something that our developers run into all the time. And this is not being made easier by having these very different environments on Android that technically are both powered by Chromium-based browsers, but still behave very, very differently. And how we think of this is that API fragmentation basically increases the cost for developers to build for Android as a platform. You build something for the browser, you assume that it works, but later on in your statistics, you're going to find out that a certain percentage of your users don't use the browser, they use in-app browsers of sorts, and they don't get the features they expect to get. And suddenly you have to change your website to figure out what's next. Now, is this actually a problem? So this is some data that is focused on the sources that we have available from Chrome, just specifically Chrome. And the reason for that is quite simple. I just don't know what's going on in the other browser engines. So if anyone has experiences, I'd love to learn from that. What we're finding is that Webview in-app browsers, and I deliberately call it in-app browsers because I'd like to focus on the displaying third-party pages here, account for just over a quarter of the time spent on the web for our users. And that's quite a lot, right? And with the state fragmentation, but also with the API fragmentation, that means that for certain categories of websites, particularly those that are often loaded and shared outside of these environments, think news websites, e-commerce sites, that means that 25+% of users might not have all the features available that you think are available there. So meet WebPlayer. The thinking that we have behind this is that there's a contrast between what we intended to do and what developers are actually doing. So the way how I look at it is that Webview is not a good component to build in-app browsers. Webview has a really big cost to it. Webview has a really old API. It was part of the initial release of Android 2008, and it's barely gone through any deprecation since. It's really hard to change. Users have different versions of it. And building a browser on top of that with the APIs that it exposes for permission control, for state control, for cookie injection is incredibly hard. Now, we started to think about what if we were to provide a component, something like WebPlayer, specific for the purpose of building in-app browsers. WebPlayer is a project that we announced just over a year ago. And even today, it's primarily focused on internal Google use cases. And what this means is that WebPlayer, it exists in the Chromium source code. You can download the code today. Some of you might have already played with it, but it's not finished. It doesn't have a stable API. Anything could change at any moment. So please don't rely on it just yet. WebPlayer is like Webview, its own content embedder. It does not use Chrome. And the big question that we're trying to answer for ourselves right now is this something that we should support for non-Google applications, for any in-app browser out there, perhaps for other use cases as well? Like, is there, to phrase this differently, is there an industry appetite for a supported component like this? The goal of WebPlayer is that it will support all the same web platform features as the default browser does. So Chrome in our case, that also means that it has user interface. So for example, WebPlayer comes with an Omnibox. WebPlayer comes with a content picker, a photo picker, which are absent in Webview, but also system integration code. So code that interacts with the system, for example, to get a push subscription, is something that should be available in WebPlayer and make functionality available almost for free. Continuing on that, WebPlayer embedders should be able to get new web platform features for free. And this is one of the costs for Webview. If we ship a new API in Chrome today, and then we add the Webview APIs to control it on top of that, then there's still a piece of the funnel where every app that includes Webview and would like to enable this API has to do work and implement code in order to make this feature work in the first place. Which still would lead to a lot of inconsistencies because that's a priority for some embedders, but not for other embedders. Webview uses a slightly different approach. Things work by default, but where it makes sense, WebPlayer exposes the necessary APIs to be able to customize that experience. So to give a concrete example, WebPlayer includes an Omnibox, but you don't have to use the Omnibox. WebPlayer includes the ability to request permissions, but that also is something that you don't have to use if you want to customize it. WebPlayer will not share full browsing state with the browser. That is a really, really tricky problem. And instead of that, what we're doing with WebPlayer is that we plan to identify and solve for the key user problems. So the things that you really run into as a user. You're signed out, your history doesn't work, payment information is not available. How can we solve those critical use cases and make sure that when there's a user journey, and I realize I'm using the term quite a lot, how that it can be completed without these hurdles and without abandon rates, for example, because you thought you were logged in, but you're not. Will it solve all these issues? Nah, it won't. That would be too easy, right? In fact, it's introducing yet another content embedder, which means that code that currently lives in Chrome still will not be available in WebPlayer. And if you look at this graph, it's actually going to make the problem worse if we don't tackle this problem head on and figure out how to fix this. So basically, we're just beginning to explore this, and the problem is going to get worse. And we'd love your participation in understanding and like how can we address this, and this is important for you as well. Continuing a little bit on among the line of thinking that basically we're having multiple content embedders. We live in this world where the Chrome directory may or may not be available, and for half the page views and time spent on a web on Android, it may not be available at all, which is an assumption that is not one that most Chromium and Blink developers make today. What could we do in order to address that? So from a bit of a code architecture, this very roughly is how we think of Chromium as a layering. Android Webview, Chrome WebPlayer, all of this is open source, directly depend on content. And what is happening already, and what we'd like more and more feature teams to adopt, is to start thinking about the components directory as a location where your code could live. So previously, Chrome is just this big monolithic directory in which everything lives. Our idea, I think it was Darren or Ben Goodyear at one point who described this, that we think of content and Chrome and then the components directory as building blocks for a browser that you can pick and mix them as you like them, what's necessary, what you want to have, what you don't want to have. And with your feature being available in the components directory, it's much easier to still implement it in the same way, and then to make it available in Chrome, Android Webview, WebPlayer, wherever it needs to be. And that actually already is a lot easier than it used to be. So previously, things like user interface, profile preferences didn't used to be there. They now live there. And I recently converted something, and it actually was positively surprising how easy that was. So yeah, what I'd love to talk about today with all of you is basically, is there an appetite for a browser component like this? Web platform parity for WebPlayer is an explicit goal, and we've not been doing a good job at that for the Webview component. Where should we be? Web platform test is something that we're considering. Documentation is something that we're considering. But there's a lot of code out there, and there's not a lot of awareness that browsing experience on Android is so fragmented as it starts. And yeah, what other flows are important if we're not able to share the full browsing state? We're thinking about identity, about payments, about sharing, notifications, things like that. are there other gaps we're not thinking about? So yeah, that's basically how I'd like to see the discussion. Thank you for listening to me so far. Yeah, Majid.
Thanks. That was very interesting. Something you touched on that, like you mentioned that it's not possible or it's very tricky to share the browser state with the web layer. Would you mind kind of give a high level explanation of why that is the case? Maybe I missed it, but that would be very useful.
No, of course. You're actually doing Ryan a favor because that totally was my planted question. It's basically browsing state is everywhere. And for those of you that have been building web apps for a little while, this started way back in the 90s when window.name was used as a hack to get around basically cross-origin restrictions because you could read that for the opener. The problem there is that it's really, really hard to capture all state. What we have from an implementation point of view in content are the storage partitions, but they leak state into preferences in the Chrome layer, and then you've got additional databases. For example, in my case, the GCM driver that has push subscriptions, things like that. Making that consistent and available across all applications is an incredibly hard problem. Now, we could do it, right? But sharing state also has an important privacy consideration. That means that it's not just the browser that's able to access a state, but embedders who usually have use cases that require them to be able to access a DOM, for example, to be able to introspect whether something could be social engineering or just a scam. That also means that they would be able to see if you're logged in or what your cookie state is. And that writing cookies to a particular origin might override others if that's write only. And that eventually leads to an even weirder, stranger situation with really impossible security trade-offs.
So as a possible follow-up, so is it possible to imagine an option such that an embedder gives up this ability to reach and inspect DOM instead gets access to the shared state kind of as a, I know it's technically hard to share a state, but I was wondering in terms of the security trade-off.
Absolutely, we could absolutely do that, and I think that's something that's really worth considering. I think from a user point of view, there's a couple of other things we have to think about. For example, when you go to Android settings and you look at the applications that are installed, you'll find that the browser that you use is usually used for a lot of the battery consumption, a lot of the storage consumption, etc. Even though you might be experiencing things as part of other applications. If we were to share state, it would actually be really hard for another application to read into Chrome's data directory or for Chrome to read into the data directory of an arbitrary application. How like that sort of state and permission attribution might end up being really confusing as well. And that also goes for permissions. For example, you might remember, oh, I gave a particular website permission to use permission to use location, something like that. How do you get rid of it? If you do that through application 1, if it's then part of that application, and application 2, it's part of the browser, for annoying permissions like notifications, that might make the problem worse. Danielle?
Hey, Peter. I have a questions about how much power the embedder of WebLayer will have. So today, embedder for Webview has a lot of power over Webview. It can have the size, and then it can inspect the content. What is the boundary between embedder and WebLayer?
So we're not sure yet. Right now, the easiest way to think of WebPlayer is being very similar to WebView. So CCTs are a custom activity that are drawn separate from your application. It's something that you can't draw anything over. So we know that all the user interface is secure, where both WebView and WebPlayer are displayed as Android fragments. That means that you can resize them as you want. You can scroll them. You can position them as they want. You can also draw things over them to basically scam users into clicking on buttons. In terms of DOM access, We're honestly not sure. This is something that personally I would love to really like reduce as much as we can. But there are really important business reasons why sites might want this. Name, for example, take an example. For example, I'm just going to name Pinterest. They have a really good use case where if you pin a website, they would like to be able to inspect the DOM and then find the highest resolution of a particular image in order to just make that share as nice and effective as it can be. How would you address a use case like that? And I think we just have to be very conscious of that balance between user and developer needs, and definitely err on the side of the user where that makes sense. But we shouldn't forget about the other either. Christian?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. Yeah, at Microsoft, we've been looking at your work on WebLayer, and obviously quite excited about it. Well, for one thing, we have the Webview, and we'd love to get rid of dependency on Chrome in our Webview as much as possible. So that seems like the optimal tool to do that. And then any kind of a stable interface that we can put between the browser and the web platform is music to our ears, because it obviously has embedders and makes our life a lot easier. So totally supportive of the work. We noticed that a lot of the work right now seems to be on Android. But the way you presented it here and the way it's presented in your README seems to imply that this is gonna you're gonna get the same level of functionality on other platforms. Is that the case, and how are you thinking of that?
The WebPlayer, nothing. There are few bits about the WebPlayer code that are really specific to Android. Most of it is just general C++ code. It can be compiled on other platforms, and it's just not something that we support right now, because the use cases that we're trying to address are really focused on Google use cases on Android.
Right.
So it's not been a priority yet. And I think as part of evaluating like what is the interest, what would people like to use this for, the question of platform support is really important there. Conventionally, most Chrome directories support any platform like the rest of Chrome. It's just something that we haven't made a decision on yet.
Okay. And we had the same question about the DOM access web contents. We went through Chrome, and I think we counted something like 30,000 references to web contents or something like that. So it's clear that to write a fully featured browser, or at least something that has most of these features, you do need access to the content, and I think that's what you were expressing. I guess that's essentially the main questions. There's a number of features that we're sort of curious where you see them, whether they're sort of above or below the boundary. For example, things like extensions and safe browsing, for example. How do you think of these kind of features?
I haven't thought about extensions yet. I think I can see a number of issues with extensions in multiple separate isolated browsing environments,
right,
where I think that something like safe browsing, absolutely. I think that safe browsing is a sort of security feature that our users have learned to rely upon. And I think even these days we make it available in Webview as well. Question for you, if I may, Christian.
Sure.
Would you envision something like so? Let's hypothesize that WebPlayer might be a stable API at some point in the future. Would you imagine that we might have a cross-platform API, like that if you want to write an app that embeds a WebPlayer, that might use a very similar API between Windows and Android?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the way what we've seen of the WebLayer so far, it actually matches an effort that we had started several years ago internally at Microsoft to try to allow other teams to embed the browser functionality at the right level, and then at the same time be able to build the full browser on it. either Webview or full browser or whatever, or an app. And so it really matches. I mean, we've shared some of the documentations on that with you guys, so I don't know how much of that you've seen, but it really matches kind of the same concept, and we totally welcome that on all platforms. On all platforms, for one, so that we can build Webview or other sort of embeddable controls for the web. And then the second, obviously, thought is, can we build a full browser on this? And is that the way that embedders should look at embedded Chromium in the future? Are we sort of saying, hey, this might at some point somewhat replace content and be the right level of boundary between the browser, the app, and the web platform? All questions that we're more than willing to debate and contribute to. Does that answer your questions? I want to make sure I'm on it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Yeah, we're thinking about those exact same questions as well, and just figuring out how to position this. Obviously, rewriting a browser is a big job.
No kidding. Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, as a small aside, I have very fond memories of embedding MS.HTML.dll in some Win32 app.
That was real sport then. Yeah, anything we can do to have a bit of a stable separation between code that embedders might add and code that the Chromium community will contribute to Chromium. For us, it's goodness, because it as an embedder and as a Chromium contributor, it just makes our life so much simpler. And I think there's benefit for all of us. Yeah.
Cool. Brian mentions in chat that he missed a bit of a call, so I'll add the slide deck to the sheet in a moment. You can read it all back, and yeah, feel free to reach me on Slack, email, Twitter, wherever tends to work.
Hey, one more quick question, if I may. Have you guys thought about? We looked for them and didn't see a lot of them, but are you guys planning on adding a bunch of tests that would actually test the API and the contracts in the API itself? Sort of as a way to stabilize it.
It's I think that the main question personally that I would want to answer about the API is to really reevaluate everything that's being exposed so far for appropriateness for non-Google parties. There's some really low-level stuff in there, like being able to hook into the browser startup parts, and I don't think most applications need something like that.
Mm-hmm.
As the API goes through stable, I definitely want to do something like that. We actually tried this with custom tabs, and custom tabs in Android X has a number of tests, but running full end-to-end tests is actually really, really difficult, and that's not something that our infrastructure is set up for right now. Peter Gunn, if you're on the call, you might have more information to add there.
Nothing much other than, we've got tests for the Android X part of it, but yeah, we looked into having end-to-end things. It was difficult.
Okay.
Excellent. And with that, we're on time. So thank you very much for listening. And please reach out to us if you have any more questions, want to talk. And if you've got use cases for using anything like WebPlayer, please reach out. We'd love to learn about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.